Welcome back. Today we're going to be reacting to another interview between, at this time, it's an investor, potential investor, and a former Palantir evangelist. So first, I just wanted to open by giving a background. What is a Palantir evangelist? We saw last year they're rehiring for the role, so I just wanted to go through this. On this evangelism team, they're looking for individuals who are passionate about helping the government better execute its most essential missions through technological innovation. The mission of evangelism is to educate key leaders about Palantir. As part of the mission, we introduce and explain Palantir to a diverse range of people: politicians, journalists, leading researchers, influential bloggers, government, you get the idea. And working with the evangelism team offers a truly unique opportunity to combine technical skills and learning with impactful policy work. So that's essentially what an evangelist is working on at Palantir. Now, in this video, we are going to be hearing from a former evangelist to get a better sense on what's going on with Palantir. This was another interview in 2020. We're going to be progressing much further forward in not too much time, but I certainly think this is going to be an interesting discussion. I'll be reacting to it in real time. Let's go.
So just to give you some background, I'm an investor, and we're spending some time researching Palantir, given your power role there. We're excited to connect and hear some of your perspectives on the company and where it's positioned with customers in its industry and a few other things. So maybe as a starting point, it would be helpful if you could just give me kind of your brief background and specifically what your role was at Palantir so I can tailor my questions appropriately.
I decided to join Palantir in early 2013. And just to give you a sense of how seriously they treat things, I interviewed with 18 different people before I joined the company, which is a pretty extreme breadth of conversations to have. They didn't really know what to do with me, which was part of the problem and part of why it was such an extended series of conversations. I was one of the first non-technical, and by that, non-computer science degree, non-programming role. Most everyone at the company, which was about 700 to 800 employees at the time, was, in their own way, world-class as a dev, and they were. Palantir was growing its government side business and its commercial business at the same time. They had a growing need to tell their story to senior government officials. I did that bill. And I had the loose job description to translate what is apparently technical business into plain English for folks in the military services, and then folks in Congress and folks on the civilian side of DoD. But I was hired into two different roles, dual-headed. One was in a group called Identity, which no longer exists within the company. But the description there was, in essence, to maintain the internal culture while going from, say, 800 employees to 2,000 employees over the next several years. Palantir is a pretty eccentric internal culture, highly technical, and they wanted to make sure that the secret sauce, which, as Peter would always say, the culture eats strategy for breakfast, was maintained at all costs. And to my knowledge, that has never changed, that conviction. So that was one of my jobs. That was primarily based out in Palo Alto, but I was living and working out of the, at that time, Tysons Corner, Virginia office. But I would frequently fly out there, interact with the devs and the rest of the team for that role. The second role, and the role that really started to win out over time, was a team called Evangelism, a smallish team on the order of, call it, a dozen folks, even far fewer than that when I arrived. And the charge of that team was really business development, to grow Palantir's DoD and non-DoD federal government business in the US, and that involves a fight unlike any other against the entrenched bureaucracy and entrenched relationships among government employees and the traditional systems integrators, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, etc. And we were attempting to enter a market in a way that very few have done successfully. And I'm speaking, I think, now, you probably have fewer than 5 at the time. It was really only SpaceX and Palantir who were able to do this in any meaningful way. And it took a massive, decade-long investment and fight. I don't know if you're familiar with any of that history, but it's a pretty tremendous story in retrospect. None of it preordained at the time, the principal axis of which was our largest customer at the time, the US Army. And their program, which is called a program of record called the Distributed Common Ground System, or DCGS, and that was the intelligence side of the house where soldiers were. If you just read a bunch of articles about Palantir, you really wouldn't understand what makes it tick and what motivates it.
And it's what's so true about so much of the sensational media around Palantir and where it sort of misses the mark in regards to the actual impact that this company is having.
And there's a very consistent bent towards, how would you put this? Palantir was attempting to break into new markets and would do it in very unconventional ways and would, in many cases, apply pressure rather than what you might call a peace strategy, where you're just trying to play nice in the sandbox. It takes a lot of outside-the-box thinking that's very counterintuitive to a person like me. I had to learn for years to reset my intuition about what it would take to break into these markets, and can be a long time to learn that if you try to do it in the way that the traditional systems integrators do, you would inevitably fail. It became highly controversial within the company about whether or not we should sue our number one customer, as that typically is not a very good business development strategy. And at the end of the day, the CEO, along with a few others of the company, said, look, we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for the country to make sure that a program that has failed over the course of the decade at the cost of $6 billion to the taxpayer and at the cost of a dysfunctional system in the hands of soldiers. It's necessary to display some of these, what we would call corrupt relationships, and actually get into the hands of soldiers, tech that actually works. And that sounds a little bit salesy to say it that way, but it's certainly what we felt at the time, and it's been borne out. Now, of course, Palantir won a massive contract for that very same program. And we, the Army eventually, and I was in all the depositions. I listened to all the depositions. And it was incredible how the Army has changed its tune over the last 3 to 4 years and come around to every one of the arguments that we made during the court case. And I guess what I'm trying to express to you is for at least a decade, Palantir has fought a fight that was 1 in a million. A very long shot fight and came out successfully, at least in the context of this one program. And most companies would not have gone to those lengths. So take what you know about Elon Musk and some of his moon shots and his ability to throw his weight around and apply that, to some extent, how Palantir thinks. They take long-term bets. They have conviction. They invest around that conviction, and they will amass sort of the talent internally to go after some of what we would call the problem sets or the problems on the ground that are worth solving.
Yep, and that's exactly it. I think that's why Palantir has such a strong retail investor base, albeit it's been sort of tested in the last couple years. But I think that really is visible, this desire to attack something great and make something great of this company and solve really important, meaningful problems for some of the world's most important institutions. So I think that's definitely understood by at least the investors in the company. They see sort of what the future is and what it will be and how Palantir is going to play an important role in that. And of course, you could say those that are not invested don't necessarily see that same future playing out. But I certainly agree with this, and it's actually really great to hear from an insider in the company. And another thing I would say now that we're pausing at this point is I didn't realize how much the evangelist position, I guess you could say, is certainly more on the sales side. It definitely has sales aspects to it. And I think that's really important when you consider how is Palantir able to grow to $1 billion in revenue without a sales team with just Alex Karp as a salesperson. It seems like they were able to potentially leverage some of the evangelist team as pseudo salespeople to really get the message out there. And so, of course, they need to move past that as they continue to scale. But something to think about and something that I hadn't previously considered.
The key thing to understand about how Palantir thinks is to get access to problems. You're not going to build a profitable business or any business that's worthwhile unless you're trying at all times to win access to the hardest problems for the engineers to solve. Because as Alex Karp would tell you, your principal goal is to get engineers in the seat right next to people who have an urgent problem that is, from an engineering perspective, really hard. So that, at the very early stages of the company, was around the counterterrorism mission set after the 9/11 report came out. And in sort of 2004, when the company was founded, they said, look, we think we can help the country find terrorists. And we believe that data integration is central to that effort, the sort of connecting the dots thesis. And we think we can build a platform over the course of 3 years that would do it in a way that's privacy protective.
So can you walk me through that history? Is that kind of the starting kernel of Palantir? Like, can you start there and walk me through the founding vision and how things have evolved?
So the company really has its roots in PayPal. And the whole deal with PayPal, and this is more than just boilerplate, origin story. Peter obviously comes out of the PayPal mafia. And at the time, the core inside of that company, which had an existential problem early on with Russian oligarchs essentially trying to launder money through PayPal. They couldn't figure it out for the longest time, who was using their platform in ways that were either illegal or defrauding their own customers, which would make them eventually have to shut down their business. So they basically applied a bunch of human brain power to figure out who was doing that through a bunch of different ways. They failed at doing that. Then they said, look, let's just build some algorithms to run against our data sets in the back end, and that failed. And then they said, let's build a platform which would allow really smart people who know money laundering and really sophisticated algorithms married together, and that solves the problem.
And there it is, right? It's a Palantir solution. That's exactly why he's explaining this. It's humans and machines on their own are really not the best, way to solve a given problem, especially a problem as complex as what Palantir is doing, is what PayPal was trying to attack. And it's really when you bring these two together is where you get the most insightful, certainly, outcomes.
And so Peter said stuff. What we just did there at PayPal to solve an existential problem is something that is universal in the next 10 to 20 years. And lots of different companies are going to need to have an agnostic data integration platform and marry sort of the human-computer symbiosis. Like a world grandmaster chess champion with a computer is way better than either a computer or a grandmaster, if that makes any sense. So after PayPal was bought by eBay, they had a bunch of money to play with, the various members of the mafia, the PayPal mafia. And Peter, among other things, decided to found Palantir, canvassed his own personal network, recruited Alex Karp to run the company. And 4 or 5 of them founded and funded the company for about a 3-year period, giving it a long runway to develop the tech, which they knew was going to be very difficult to do. And all along, and I say this with complete sincerity, all along, the idea, because Alex Karp is the opposite political philosophy of Peter Thiel, all along, the idea was to put access controls into the lineage and pedigree of the data. So at any moment, if anyone changes any state of the system, adds or deletes or changes it, it's any particular data point along the way that is in the system. That reflects immutable law.
And this is what's so important about Palantirs, because despite what you hear, from the media, is that really was the founding standpoint of the company, and privacy came first. That's literally why the company was founded, to be able to protect these civil liberties. And so that's just what you have to come back to, right? Is that was the starting place, and that's what everything was built off of.
So it's, in a way, built like Bitcoin is built, that you can have a data pedigree, that you can reverse back all the way to the beginning of any instance and see who has done what and who has seen what. So the idea was, if you want to improve security in the country and go after terrorists, you don't want that to be destructive to privacy in the country. Yep. So the way I understand this and the way that it worked in practice, and I've seen the platform in operation thousands of times. The idea is to push the efficient frontier forward. If you can extend your hands in front of you and interlock your fingers, privacy on the one hand, security on the other, it's just push your hands away from your body and extend that efficient frontier where you can improve both privacy and security at the same time. What has happened in the last 20 years is you've got all these data integration platforms, and they get super messy because they're not built around a data object model where it creates in the virtual world a likeness of what you're actually seeing in the real world. So the way we think about it is Palantir is building a data model of the universe according to a CIA analyst or an army analyst in the way that they think about things logically, so people, places, and things. Yep. So you've got, and this is the secret sauce, it's not a secret at all because it's all over the internet if you really understand it. But basically, the real breakthrough was how do you build a data model that is flexible? And it's called the dynamic ontology. So at any given time, you could say, hey, look, there's a bunch of different types of tanks that the enemy has, or a bunch of different types of weapons that the enemy has, and different kinds of people that you're running into. Another way of saying flexible data model is dynamic ontology. It means that you can change at any given time how your universe is modeled in the virtual world. And so if somebody from platoon A inserts data point X about person Y, that and another piece of data is put in there about person Y, it doesn't duplicate the data and then create a mess of incomprehensibility. So what you want is super clean objects in the system, objects from a place, a thing, or an event, or a media type. That's getting into the weeds. In any event, that was the thing that, what I'm trying to convey to you is Palantir was painstaking in building the infrastructure layer underneath the solution to the problem. And so they were, and this is how they approach problems to this day, is let's solve the hardest engineering problem so that we can make sure whatever the actual solution on top of that is the most useful to really get at the harder operational problem, which is like finding and killing a terrorist. So once you've built, and by the way, just to give you a sense of how hard that is, they had to invent or at least supply a very novel, technical approach to, once they built the dynamic ontology, then you say, okay, what if two people enter a similar piece of data at near the same time that one person tries to overwrite what the other person wrote, or there's two people concurrently editing attributes on one terrorist in the system? They basically said, we need to make sure we understand the pedigree of all these edits. So they invented a thing called vector clock. And all of these edits are instantly compared by exactly GPS time signature of when they're made, compared against each other and then synchronized. And that's called peering, nexus peering, very difficult, technical and engineering problem to solve. Palantir, the whole thing is how do you empower people who are not technical to do things like data science, to do things that are required in today's day and age, but not everyone is a dev.
Exactly. I think that's what we were talking about earlier with combining human and artificial intelligence, really. That's what's so important about Palantir and how it's able to permeate so many industries and will continue to do so.
And if you think data science is going to be important in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, Palantir is trying to blaze the trail of building tools for those newly invented roles within each of these organizations.
Yep.
So just to put it clearly, let's say an aviation company is trying to look at their supply chain or their maintenance logs or all the data that's being thrown off operational aircraft. They're going to have to hire a ton of data scientists, but what platform are those scientists going to use? So Palantir is getting ahead of all of that and saying, we're building the tools for the jobs that haven't even been invented yet in that regard.
And that's, back to the idea of being 5 years ahead. And sometimes we're wondering, what exactly does that mean? Well, here's an example of that.
In my view, Palantir has been aggressively attacking the hardest engineering problems, trying to focus on those to the maximum extent possible, while honoring all of the confidentiality with their customers. And so they sit.
Yeah, and this really is a great point, right? Because it's not like Palantir is even a software company. It's certainly not a consulting company. I mean, we've gotten past that at least. That used to be an issue in terms of understanding and misconceptions. But really at its core, Palantir is an engineering company. That, software, we've seen them start to get into hardware a little bit, but I don't think that's a firm commitment. So the engineering is really what powers many of the most successful businesses that we've ever seen, and stocks for that matter. So it definitely makes sense to me.
Can't talk about a lot of the wins and the victories that they've had along the way. I do know the main bifurcation of how the products has evolved, and meaning the principal product of the company at the time I was there was the product at that time called Palantir Gotham, like Batman Gotham. And that was the platform that was developed initially to solve the intelligence agencies and the military services mission sets. And they made that platform first to solve these government problems, but immediately began to enter adjacent markets in the commercial world. Because really, it's no different whether you're trying to fight a terrorist or whether you're trying to gain some competitive advantage in the commercial world. If the platform can handle a diversity of data at a high data scale, then if you have the ability to model things flexibly with peering and an ontology, you could go into the insurance world, the banking world, finance, which is where we initially entered. We initially entered in some of the big banks in New York, solved some of their problems with anti-money laundering, which makes sense given the PayPal history, and then to the insurance industry and a variety of other industries after that: energy, healthcare, aviation, etc., etc. And we essentially customize at each of these locations the Palantir deployment or the Palantir instance and built data models and help them solve these problems and continue to build out features that would then be wrapped back into the core platform. And so there was like a flywheel that started to happen where you got access to hard problems in various industries, built pretty universally applicable features or functionalities that were then wrapped.
What he's talking about is this customized set of features that they had to develop for these, certain instances that they were solving for with Palantir Foundry, but how those features could actually get wrapped back to the core product to make it universally applicable. And that's where a lot of the functionality came about, such that they didn't have to customize as much along the way. And this is, I think, where Palantir gets misunderstood in terms of how fast can they possibly grow if they're sending out forward deployed engineers for every single one of these organizations. And I think they're moving, further and further away from that as the product suite and software stack continues to improve.
Someone would come up with a terrific engineering solution or use case solution or feature in the insurance industry, and it would suddenly be very helpful back into the government platform, and then vice versa.
There it is.
And so that was the Palantir Gotham platform. There was a time, though, late in my tenure at the company, where they said, look, the thing that's the hardest, that our engineers are struggling with the most is like lower on the tech stack. It's not sitting there trying to come up with some button to push on the front end. The hardest part, by far, is landing the data in a way that's clean. So taking all the data from their data lake or their legacy systems and trying to coherently put it into the data model. And so there was a strategic decision made at some point to say, look, let's build a platform one layer deeper. So you've got Gotham, which we're killing it with all these different customers we're like crushing. We've got so many great engineers that can attack the problem from the back end and build these front-end one-off solutions or features. But what we ought to do is build a first-class data landing, data validation, data cleaning. And by the way, this is me conveying this from a layman's perspective, not from a computer science perspective. I would encourage you to complement my advice or contributions with somebody who's deeply technical, who has familiarity with Palantir. In any event, late in my tenure, they said we're going to build a second core platform at the company. And this is a thing that I think has become the strongest leg that Palantir has now. And it's taken a number of years to mature, just like Gotham did back in the day. And that's called Palantir Foundry. Foundry like a metallurgical foundry. And you've probably seen that on the internet or in your research. But Foundry is a way that requires a lot less forward deployed engineer, a lot fewer bodies around it that would support it. It works. Palantir works out of the box. It's a commercial, off the shelf. It's a commercial item. We sell it as a commercial item, both to the commercial sector and to the government sector. And that was what the court case was all about. And it's a fascinating story. But both Gotham and Foundry work out of the box. But Foundry is designed so that if you have a certain set of technical skills, you don't really need an assembly of Palantir engineers to help you really even customize.
So there it is, right? Is Foundry, and I got a little ahead of myself on the last pause there, but if you have the technical talent within your organization, you don't even need the forward deployed engineers, right? So it certainly helps to have that technical talent, but as far as I understand it, as Palantir continues to develop the platform, I believe that they're moving towards, a moment where the additional cost on top of deploying to a new organization is going to be eliminated, and they aren't going to have to do that anymore sometime in the future.
And I think the real goal is to make this an ecosystem that is so mature that essentially, if you are in data science or if you're in data processing, data analysis, really the core platform that wins the day is Palantir Foundry. And so in the same way that if you were great at data analysis 30 years ago, you were using Excel. That's a thing. So Foundry used a lot of the tech that was developed for Gotham and tacked it one layer deeper and said, if you're going to win a contract with the US Army to look at all their personnel records and to integrate them, those personnel records are caught in 500 different legacy databases. How do you do that in a way that doesn't take 5 years and have everyone go insane in the process? And so and I've seen this in operation, and it's a thing to the hold. It's really impressive. It's very powerful. There's very little excellent, I would call it YouTube type videos that show it in operation, but it's a highly powerful tech stack that works. And it blew me away how far Palantir has come in the past couple of years.
So this is someone that left the company a few years prior to 2020 when this interview was taking place. And internally knowing the pace of innovation, still being surprised, right, by how far the company had come is certainly, encouraging to hear.
What is, if you look at each of those products, how are they deployed? And how much of it is what you would think of as traditional subscription software versus more hands-on, kind of bespoke consulting work, just given the nature of some of these customers?
Yes. This has been a topic of conversation at the company for a very long time. And I think Foundry was the thing that fundamentally changed the service versus product conversation.
So that is, I guess you could say, a very interesting turning point, not one that I had considered, but the amount of work that we were hearing earlier in the conversation that goes into the Gotham product to deploy it versus Foundry, being the next generation of that, requiring much less technical experience and setup, I think is certainly something to consider.
And again, just a caveat, not at the company now. I don't have any of those figures, but I know for a fact that Foundry is a lower touch point, requires fewer FTEs, and certainly is usable by the average Joe. And I'm not talking the average non-technical person, a reasonably technical person at these companies. And so I think Foundry is a different equation as it relates to the product versus services debate. It is built from the ground up so that it's agnostic to any kind of data set. It's basically built in a way that you would expect of software as a service these days, where basically, there's drop-downs for everything. What kind of data are you integrating? How do you want to integrate it? It's like, in the early stages of Palantir, the whole thesis was Gotham was, it did require a heavy footprint of Palantirians to get it to work because it was such a sophisticated piece of software. And Foundry is probably, I guess you could call it even more sophisticated because they have abstracted away a lot of the problems that the engineers have been working on. So anything that was pissing off Palantir engineers internally, I think the whole thing over a decade period was let's abstract that away and build it into the core platform. But I do know just anecdotally that their business is very strong in ways that there's less pain with each new deployment, put it that way.
Got it.
You really ought to understand.
Less pain meaning obviously less cost, right? Less cost associated, which is super important for scale. And when Palantir ultimately hits scale, the profitability is just going to look so much better. That's essentially what we're getting from this point.
As an investment, as a potential prospective investor.
Yes. Okay. And what about on the go-to-market side? How did Palantir? Obviously, it started in, I think you said the Army, and then moved into intelligence and has had strong roots in government, but then very quickly started moving into other commercial areas, private sector areas like banking and manufacturing. From a go-to-market perspective, how does Palantir, or how did it when you were there, think about going out and finding customers?
If you're already successful at an investment bank, you would go to a hedge fund. And if you're already, or private equity firm or something like that, very adjacent problems. And so there was a lot.
If you think about the types of problems that these customers face, like what were some commonalities that made Palantir a compelling product for both an insurance company and a retail bank, for example?
Yes, that's a great question. Great question. I would say because Palantir had recruited legit A-player, world-class engineers, the risk of failure on each deployment for a lot of the folks that were the initial customers was relatively lower than their other options. Because the tech fundamentally worked.
And we hear Alex Karp, harping on the engineering talent so much, and this is what it comes down to, right, is Palantir's product, it's known to work. It's known to be the best, and they need to maintain that.
It had to be customized, to be sure, to the problem, but you had legitimately excellent engineers sitting in your organization. And then even better ones back in Palo Alto, supporting them and building the core product. And so you knew that if you're going to take very old punch card, like the classic, one of the things I haven't talked about is law enforcement. We worked with a ton of law enforcement organizations, and you would not believe how bad their data is. And the whole thrust of it is how do you get the data in one place, modeled in a way that a cop could look at a screen and solve a problem with it. And so Palantir was already built and tested and very robustly developed around similar problems. So it was an easy jump to apply Palantir Gotham, which was great in the military services to law enforcement. And the key value prop was just purely, it would cleanly integrate data in a way that you could build on top of it and read a file on a given suspect that had reliable data that you could then bring to a decision maker and prove your case. The go/no-go decision of actually killing a terrorist requires you to make a defensible case with data. And if it's a bunch of stuff like in a shared drive, no one's going to trust it. So it's got to be very falsifiable and trustworthy, and you could interrogate the data itself. And Palantir was just simply built in a way that you could do that. So it made data integration easy. And then there was a bunch of tooling built on top of that would, if you're an expert in telephone records, within a month, you would have the ultimate tool built to take all the telephone records and slice and dice them in a way that made it a single button click to figure out the person who was doing unusual things. Palantir has a certain degree of fearlessness about it. I've always thought that Palantir would be quite well served to be a bit more open about everything. And I think they're actually doing that now much more so than when I was there. But Palantir, fundamentally, is eccentric in the sense that they are okay with misfits joining the company, that have spikes, real talent, and a real specific niche, applying that talent in a way that's beneficial to the company as a whole and to the customers as a whole, and compensating for whatever weaknesses are on the other side of that talent. Palantir has a way of going after really hard, real-world problems and not getting distracted by a lot of outside external pressure. I wonder if that's similar to how Oracle does business. They just remain very focused on the core engineering problems. They are, I think, very dogged in entering new markets and finding a way to add value in those new markets, and I think, have been outside-the-box thinkers in how to do that. Yes, I think they're just an eccentric, very highly eccentric tech, highly centric people who, nevertheless, basically let you be yourself. And they are no authentically Silicon Valley. They are not a pretender like some of these other companies who, or would-be competitors. Everybody tries to be a data integration company these days. If you're like a traditional consultancy, there's just no way you can bolt that on. It is baked into the DNA of Palantir. They are a tech company through and through. They approach problems as tech problems and not as consultants, or they don't approach it in the same way as I would call a service business or a traditional service business.
Exactly.
They are tech first in the approach, how to generalize the problem and get the tech stack to solve it. Palantir gets an extraordinarily bad rap or reputation when it comes to some people who are privacy advocates.
Yep.
I think if I were a private advocate, I would be really cheering on Palantir rather than poo-pooing it, because the tech actually provides the ability for oversight. And in fact, we advised the government during the Obama administration on some of the safeguards that you should put in systems that would effectively help you improve privacy over time.
This is a great point, right? I mean, Palantir's doing some really important work, especially on the privacy side, that should be celebrated, and it's hated, actually, for other reasons, right? It's really something to be celebrated.
The biggest threat to privacy is not these modern, very powerful systems. It's the old ones that have no safeguards built into them whatsoever. So there's no way to know who's doing what with any of the data. And so I think there is like a fundamental misconception among many people who don't understand the company. So privacy is a huge issue for you to understand. Palantir is always about like a mission first, and I think that's not going to go away really ever. And that's like reflected in the idea of Karp saying, screw it, let's solve a really important problem across the world right now. And let's flex the entire workforce to solve COVID, and in a very meaningful way, not lip service. So mission driven is critically important. Let's see. I'm going to keep going here. The platform is always built with basic design features that, like I discussed, like Nexus peering. It's open. The core argument we had with the Army was that we were a proprietary platform and not open. In other words, we were closed and we owned the data, and once the Army gave Palantir the keys to the castle, then they would have a black box on their hands. And they wouldn't know how it worked in all of this, and we had such proprietary tools that it would not be prudent or reasonable for them to give large contracts to Palantir. And so for a 4 years of my life, 4.5 years of my life, I fought with people on that very core issue. Let's say tomorrow, the Army said, screw Palantir, we're going to go to some other solutions. They could take all their data with them. It's all in XML. They could just put it into whatever else they wanted. And that was the core. That was one of the core disagreements. We're locked into Palantir, and that simply wasn't the case. We showed that in the course of the case and so forth. And then they said, look, Palantir is not interoperable with all of our other systems. And we said, we proved beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's like way more interoperable than any of their systems that they're trying to build from scratch, because it was a classic thing. So like you can export in Microsoft Excel or Word. You can export to 30 different file formats. In Palantir, you can export to 30 different file formats and import from 150 file formats. It's that sort of stuff. It's if you've got a robust and comprehensive commercial business and a robust government business interoperability points with far more things than like Northrop Grumman is going to produce based on what the government is telling them to build from scratch. And it was impossible to convince people of this within the government. And at the end of the day, it just proved itself de facto by soldiers saying it works and it's interoperable with everything. And the powers that be couldn't deny it anymore. And basically, interoperability is not an end state. This is what we always said them. Interoperability is not an end state. It's like a process of computer software development.
So there you have it. This is a former evangelist on Palantir's team talking about how Palantir got started as a company and some of the really core internal work being done on these very important platforms, talking about Gotham a lot and Foundry, how it's this next generation of software that's really built off of Gotham, but is so much more powerful. I really enjoyed this conversation, actually. I think each one of these really gives some deep insight into the history of the company, how it's perceived. We talked a lot about talent. I think that's super important. So let me know if you enjoyed this, if you want to see more. Until next time.